Most women never realize the exact moment a man becomes unreachable, not in the physical sense, but in the silent withdrawal of his soul from the theater of validation. At first, it's imperceptible, like a candle burning low in a crowded room. He still speaks, still moves, still breathes among them. But somewhere deep in his gaze, the light they once fed on no longer bends toward their approval. Something shifts, something closes, and from that moment on, their words pierce nothing. He was not born this way. No man is. He, like every other, once carried the raw hunger to be understood, to explain himself, to pour out every detail of his reasoning so that no one could twist it, no one could question his intent. It was not weakness, it was innocence, a belief that truth must be seen to be valid. But truth, he learned, does not survive in the mouths of those who have already decided who you are. The world has a way of teaching a man the futility of explanation. It is not a single betrayal, but a slow accumulation, 1,000 tiny moments when words failed, when honesty was met not with clarity, but with suspicion, when vulnerability was wielded as a weapon against him. The human mind, especially the insecure one, does not seek truth. It seeks confirmation. It will twist the purest confession into a shape that fits its prejudice. And so, in time, he understood. The moment he explains, he offers himself up for dissection. Imagine a fortress in the hills, built not of stone, but of silence. Its gates are not locked, they are simply unmanned. Those who once stood outside, demanding entry, now find no one to argue with, no one to plead their case to. That is the man who no longer explains. His silence is not empty. It is filled with the weight of unspoken power. Every unanswered accusation becomes a mirror in which the accuser sees only themselves. You've seen it, haven't you? The way people panic when they cannot extract a justification from you. They prod, they bait, they paint you with their assumptions, hoping your protest will give them fresh clay to mold their version of you. But when you refuse, when you hold your tongue, they are left with their own reflection, and most cannot bear the sight of it. For him, this was not a strategy, it was a transformation. In Jungian terms, he had wrestled with his shadow, that primal, unpolished part of himself that longed to be defended, to be vindicated. He stopped treating it as an enemy and began to see it as a teacher. The shadow told him, "You do not owe the world an account of your soul. You owe only truth to yourself." In Stoic thought, Epictetus warned that a man cannot control the thoughts of others, only his own actions and choices. To spend life convincing others is to live as their slave. The one who refuses explanation cuts the cord that binds his worth to their perception. His energy is no longer spent on reshaping their illusions. He lets them keep their shadows, their whispers, their stories. He walks unburdened. There is something unnerving about such a man. In relationships, in the social arena, even in conflict, people expect the dance of justification, the defensive postures, the rush to correct misunderstandings. When it does not come, the script collapses, and in the collapse, they glimpse the terrifying truth. He does not need them to see him clearly. He sees himself. You may think silence is passivity, but here it is the opposite. It is active refusal, a deliberate reclaiming of ground once given away too freely. It is not the silence of defeat, but of victory too complete to require an announcement. The lion does not explain why it hunts. The storm does not justify its reign. Nature moves in accordance with itself, and so does he. Yet this transformation is not without cost. To stop explaining is to accept that some will hate you, some will leave you, some will invent fictions about you that will never be corrected. It is to accept the loss of those who only loved the version of you they could edit. But what he gained in exchange was immeasurable, the quiet liberation of no longer living on trial. And here is the paradox. The less he explained, the more his presence commanded. His words, when he chose to speak, carried weight, because they were no longer diluted by the noise of defense. People leaned in when he spoke, not because he fought to be heard, but because he no longer cared if they listened. This is why he became untouchable, not because he was harder to reach, but because he was beyond the reach of their need for his submission. He had stepped off the stage where the audience held the script. In his stillness, they felt their own instability. In his absence of defense, they saw the fragility of their attack. And in his refusal to explain, they encountered the most dangerous truth of all. Some men cannot be moved by the opinions of the crowd. It was not arrogance that hardened him. It was clarity. There is a difference between the man who closes himself off out of fear and the man who does so out of understanding. Fear builds walls to hide behind. Understanding builds walls to define the sacred ground where nothing profane may enter. He had learned that explaining himself was, in truth, an invitation for others to trespass. And trespass they had, countless times. They had taken his sincerity and reshaped it into a weapon. They had twisted his admissions into confessions of guilt, even when no crime was present. They had taken his attempts at connection as open doors to trample over boundaries that should have been respected. For too long, he thought that if he could just find the right words, he could guide them to see him clearly. But no matter how carefully he spoke, they only heard what their wounds allowed them to hear. Psychologists call this projection, the mind's tendency to cast its own shadow onto others. A bitter heart will find bitterness in your tone, no matter how softly you speak. A distrustful soul will suspect betrayal in the most transparent honesty. To engage with such people on their terms is to wrestle shadows in the dark. You cannot win because the fight is not with you. It is with their own unhealed past. So he stepped away. Not in body, but in energy. He ceased trying to untangle himself from their misunderstandings because he understood they were not misunderstandings at all. They were choices. Choices to interpret him through the lens of their prejudice. Choices to maintain a narrative that gave them comfort, even if it cost him peace. This is the essence of shadow work. The courage to see what truly belongs to you and what never did. The courage to hand back the burden of other people's pain without apology. It is not coldness, it is compassion refined by self-respect. For when you stop explaining, you stop stealing from others the chance to face their own illusions. You allow them the dignity or the agony of confronting the stories they have built. In this, he embodied the Stoic lesson Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." By refusing to explain, he was no longer tethered to the storms of other minds. He became the still center, the calm within the chaos. Their approval, their outrage, their praise, their condemnation, all these were weather patterns he observed, but no longer tried to change. Yet make no mistake, this detachment is not numbness. It is heightened awareness. He feels the tension in a room when silence stretches. He senses the discomfort when accusations fall into the void without answer. He watches the way people squirm under the weight of their own assumptions. And still, he remains unmoved, for he knows that stepping into that dance again would be nothing but self-betrayal. Some call it mystery, some call it pride. But what it truly is sovereignty, the mastery of one's own narrative. And sovereignty does not explain itself to the governed. It simply is. Those who understand will never demand an explanation. Those who demand will never understand. And here is the quiet irony. The less he tried to be understood, the more people wondered about him. In the absence of his voice defending itself, they were left with only their own curiosity. Curiosity, unlike accusation, is fertile ground. It makes people listen instead of argue. It makes them watch instead of interrupt. And in time, those capable of depth came closer, not because he pulled them in, but because his silence made space for them to come. He learned that energy wasted on explaining could instead be invested in building his craft, building his body, building his mind. He poured into himself what he once spilled into the empty hands of those who never intended to hold it with care. And in doing so, he created a life so aligned, so self-sufficient, that the noise outside the gates could no longer reach the throne within. This is when the shift became irreversible. When your worth no longer depends on someone else's comprehension, you walk differently. You speak less, but your words hit harder. You look into eyes without searching for belief in them. You stop rehearsing your defense in your mind before you speak. You do not brace for misunderstanding because you no longer fear it. And in that space, something beautiful happens. You find a peace so solid, it no longer matters who stays and who goes. For the ones who leave were never truly there, and the ones who remain require no explanation. They feel the truth in your being, and that is enough. There is a strange kind of lightness that follows this transformation, not the giddy lightness of escape, but the steady, grounded lightness of release. When a man stops explaining himself, he steps out of the endless trial where the jury is never satisfied. That courtroom exists only in the minds of the insecure, but for years he stood in it, reciting testimony, hoping for a verdict that would set him free. What he never realized was that freedom could never come from their ruling. It had to come from him walking out, and walk out he did. Not with slammed doors, not with bitter speeches, but with the quiet, decisive movement of someone who understands that the argument was never real. The accusations, the misunderstandings, the constant demands for justification, these were not about him at all. They were about the emptiness in others that could not stand the existence of a man who would not be controlled. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole, integrating both light and shadow into a unified self. This is not a journey for the faint-hearted. It requires the courage to face what you once tried to hide, and the discipline to protect it from those who would distort it. To stop explaining is to acknowledge that your truth is not a public commodity. It is your property, your inheritance, your birthright. It can be shared, but never surrendered. People who live in the prison of public opinion cannot fathom this freedom. They survive on the currency of approval. They measure worth in the weight of applause or the sharpness of criticism. When they see someone who does not play by those rules, it threatens the entire structure of their identity. That's why they try harder to draw him back into the debate, to make him care again about what they think. But he doesn't. He has crossed a line in the sand, and on the other side is a world where their voices no longer hold jurisdiction. This is not the detachment of indifference, it is the detachment of mastery. Indifference is dull, apathetic, lifeless. Mastery is alive, watchful, deliberate. He is not disconnected from the world, he simply interacts with it on his own terms. His silence is not the absence of thought, but the presence of choice, and choice is power. When he does speak, it is never to defend, but to declare. His words are no longer chained to the need for validation. They arise from the stillness of knowing. There is a difference between speaking to be heard and speaking because you have something to say. He chooses the latter, and in doing so, he reclaims his voice from the marketplace of noise. Relationships change under this new law of being. The ones built on dependency, on constant reassurance, begin to crumble. The ones rooted in mutual respect and understanding grow stronger, for they do not demand explanations. They trust what is shown. His circle becomes smaller, but its foundation becomes unshakable. The opportunists and manipulators slip away, unable to work their craft in the face of his unyielding quiet. And here lies one of the most misunderstood truths about strength. It is not about being unbreakable. It is about being unshaken in the presence of storms. When the accusations come, and they will, he does not rush to extinguish them. Let them burn, he thinks, for lies have a way of consuming their owners. And as they burn, his stillness becomes even more pronounced, like a mountain that does not tremble at the wind. He has become untouchable, not because harm cannot be aimed at him, but because harm cannot land. There is no tether for it to cling to, no wound for it to reopen. The places where explanations once leaked his strength are sealed now, not with bitterness, but with wisdom. This is the kind of transformation that cannot be faked. The world can smell pretense, but it cannot penetrate authenticity. The result is almost paradoxical. The more he pulls away from the need to be understood, the more deeply others want to understand him. The less he speaks, the more carefully they listen. And some, the few who are capable, begin to mirror his silence, to examine their own reflex to explain, defend, justify. His presence becomes a challenge, not to his words, but to their way of living. And though he will never admit it, there is a quiet satisfaction in this, not the petty satisfaction of proving someone wrong, but the profound satisfaction of knowing he is now living in alignment with himself. No longer a puppet to perception, no longer bending his spine to fit into the narrow spaces others carved for him. He walks as though the ground itself has agreed to rise to meet his steps. Over time, his silence became something more than a personal choice. It became an atmosphere. In his presence, conversations shifted. The noise that once filled the air when people sought to trap him in explanations no longer found purchase. Those who relied on confrontation and chaos to assert their power found themselves strangely disarmed. Without the push and pull of his old defenses, their energy had nowhere to go, and so it collapsed inward. This was not a game of dominance, though many mistook it for one. It was, rather, the natural order asserting itself. In the wild, the most dangerous creature is often the one that makes the least noise. There is no wasted motion, no theatrical roar to prove its worth. The predator that survives is the one who acts from necessity, not performance. He had become that creature, disciplined, precise, and immune to the petty drama that once consumed his attention. The modern mind struggles with this concept. We live in an age that worships explanation. Every thought is expected to be broadcast. Every action justified in public view. Every choice narrated for an audience. To step away from this compulsion is to reject an unspoken contract with society, a contract that says, "We will decide your worth if you give us your reasons." His refusal was a breach of that agreement, and breaches always draw suspicion. Suspicion, however, no longer concerned him. The moment you stop explaining, you learn that suspicion is not your enemy. It is a reflection of another's insecurity. In Jungian terms, it is a projection of their shadow, the parts of themselves they cannot reconcile, now cast upon you, as if exposing you could relieve them of their own hidden truths. A man who understands this no longer wastes his breath, arguing his innocence. He knows the accuser is not seeking truth, but release from their own discomfort. In his quiet, he had found the same freedom the Stoics spoke of, the freedom to remain unmoved by that which is beyond one's control. Marcus Aurelius wrote of the inner citadel, a fortress of the soul that no external force can breach without permission. His citadel had been built brick by brick, each one laid by the moments he refused to hand over his inner peace in exchange for momentary validation. You might think such silence is lonely, and perhaps for a time it was. To shed the need for explanation often means shedding those who required it as a condition for connection. The crowd thins, the conversations grow fewer. But what remains is pure. Those who stay are not here for the performance of understanding. They are here for the presence of truth. This shift changes even the way he moves through the world. His steps no longer rush toward persuasion. His eyes no longer search for recognition. His shoulders no longer carry the weight of preemptive defense. And because of this, his energy deepens, concentrated now, like a river that has stopped spilling into shallow ditches and instead carves its way through stone. There is also a hidden cost to explaining that most never see. Every time you justify yourself to someone who does not care to understand, you reinforce their illusion of authority over your life. It is a subtle surrender, a handing over of the pen so they may write your story. He had lived long enough under such authorship to know it would always end the same way, with a version of himself he barely recognized. Now, the pen was firmly in his own hand. When the inevitable moments came, when someone challenged him, baited him, accused him, he did not harden with anger, nor did he melt into appeasement. He simply allowed their words to pass through him, like wind through an open field. No resistance, no grasping, no echo. There is nothing more unsettling to those who thrive on control than a man they cannot provoke. And yet, this peace was not fragile. It did not need protection in the way he once thought. It was not a delicate flame that could be blown out by criticism. It was a deep fire at the core of his being, untouchable by the storms outside. This is why he had become what others called untouchable, not because the world could no longer reach him, but because its reach no longer mattered. From here, life looked different. Every interaction was a choice, not an obligation. Every silence was deliberate, not empty. Every explanation he didn't give was a gift to himself, and, though they might not see it, to others, who were left to wrestle with their own narratives instead of feeding on his. With time, something remarkable happened. His silence stopped being merely a shield and became a mirror. Those who came near him could not help but see themselves reflected back. Without the distraction of his defenses, their own words and motives stood naked before them. Some found this unbearable and fled. Others lingered, unsettled but drawn in, sensing that in his quiet was an invitation, not to know him, but to know themselves. The world had trained them to expect resistance. Accusation was supposed to meet rebuttal. Insult was supposed to meet counterattack. Doubt was supposed to meet reassurance. But here, the pattern broke. The absence of explanation left them without their familiar handholds, and in that void, they faced something far more disarming than argument. The realization that their power over him had been imagined all along. This is why his presence began to feel different, heavier, yet lighter. He carried no armor, yet no blow could touch him. There was no barricade, only the vast space of self-possession that cannot be crossed without permission. People misread this as aloofness, but it was simply the absence of need, and need, once gone, takes with it the hooks by which others can pull you. Jung once said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This man had done just that, and in accepting himself, he no longer sought permission to exist as he was. He understood the paradox. Those who demand your explanations are often those least capable of receiving them. They do not seek truth. They seek confirmation of their bias. And so, he let them keep it. From the outside, this looked like detachment, but within, it was liberation. He moved through the world with the composure of a man who answers only to the voice that speaks from the deepest chamber of his own mind. That voice was not always kind, but it was honest, and it spoke with a clarity that no chorus of opinions could drown out. In Stoic discipline, this is the highest form of freedom, not the power to control others, but the mastery of not needing to. Seneca warned of the chains forged by the desire to be understood, for they bind the soul to the shifting sands of perception. This man had broken them, not with force, but with refusal, the simple, unwavering choice to let others think what they would. And this refusal began to shape his entire life. Where once he had invested hours crafting the right message, the right defense, the right plea for understanding, he now invested in himself. His body grew stronger, his craft sharper, his mind clearer. He no longer built his days around the demands of the loudest voices. He built them around what mattered to him, and in that structure, his life began to reflect the inner order he had fought to create. Even his relationships shifted into new shapes. The ones who thrived on drama dissolved into the background like shadows at sunrise. The ones who valued truth without performance drew nearer, not because he explained himself to them, but because they recognized the rare stability of someone who did not. His connections became fewer, but richer, each rooted in mutual respect rather than mutual performance. And perhaps the most unexpected change was this: his silence began to speak for him. People noticed the absence of his defense more than they had ever noticed his arguments. They began to wonder why he didn't fight to prove himself. And in that wondering, some realized that perhaps he didn't need to. Perhaps the need itself was the mark of insecurity, and the absence of it the mark of something greater. This is the quiet revolution of a man who stops explaining. It is not a loud rejection of the world, but a calm turning inward until the world's grip loosens by its own weight. And as the grip loosens, so does the fear of being misunderstood. Misunderstanding is inevitable. So is misjudgment. But neither can touch the man who has withdrawn his worth from the marketplace of other people's opinions. In the end, his untouchability was not about walls or weapons. It was about the recognition that truth is not diminished when it is doubted, nor is it strengthened when it is believed. Truth simply is. And so was he. There came a point when the very air around him seemed to shift, as if the constant invisible tug of other people's expectations had finally let go. He moved through crowded rooms without feeling the pull to perform. Eyes might follow him, tongues might whisper, but none of it reached him. He had not grown numb. Rather, he had grown immune. The noise could no longer find an opening, because the openings had been sealed by a deeper allegiance to himself. This immunity was not built overnight. It was the sum of every moment he chose: restraint over reaction, presence over performance. Each time he withheld an explanation, he strengthened the unseen architecture of his own inner citadel. At first, there had been discomfort, that reflexive ache to correct the falsehood, to defend the misunderstood choice, to make them see. But over time, that ache dulled, then disappeared, replaced by the steady warmth of knowing that his truth did not require an audience to exist. This is the paradox that escapes most people. The more you fight to be understood, the more power you give to misunderstanding. It is the law of energy. Where you place your focus, you feed growth. And for years, he had fed the wrong thing. Every justification had been nourishment for doubt, every defense a confirmation that their opinion had the right to sit in judgment. When he stopped explaining, he starved the parasite. Jung would call this individuation in its purest form, the withdrawal of the self from entanglement with the projections of others. He was no longer a canvas for their unfinished stories, no longer a vessel for the echoes of their past. And in reclaiming himself, he made peace with the fact that many would never see him clearly. That peace was the price of sovereignty, and he paid it gladly. The effects rippled outward. In a world where people wear themselves thin, trying to be perceived the right way, his refusal to participate became magnetic. Some found it intimidating, others found it irresistible. It wasn't that he tried to be mysterious. It was that his attention was no longer up for sale. When a man's sense of self is not for purchase, the marketplace becomes strangely quiet around him. In personal relationships, the dynamic changed entirely. Those who stayed learned a truth unspoken. His silence was not withdrawal from them, but withdrawal from the old compulsion to prove himself worthy of love through explanation. He would show up fully, but not conditionally. His presence was a gift, not a negotiation, and for the first time, connection felt clean, free from the undercurrent of unspoken contracts that had once drained him. Even conflict felt different now. When someone came to him with accusations, he did not meet them with counter-arguments or desperate clarifications. He listened, not to agree, not to defend, but simply to hear. And when he spoke, it was brief, deliberate, and final. No loops, no back-and-forth spirals into nowhere. He gave them nothing to push against. The storm exhausted itself without his participation. This is what made him untouchable in the truest sense. Not that the world stopped throwing stones, but that the stones could no longer wound. They struck the surface of his life and fell harmlessly away, never finding the soft, unguarded places that had once been exposed by his own need to explain. And with this came a freedom that tasted almost like rebirth. He could now walk away from conversations without replaying them in his head, without rehearsing the arguments he should have made, without wondering what impression he had left. He could leave a room knowing that the truth was not a shared possession. It belonged to him alone, and that was enough. From this vantage point, he saw the irony of his journey. In the past, his explanations had been an attempt to bring others closer. But all they had done was keep him entangled in the perceptions of those who never intended to see him clearly. By releasing the need to explain, he had finally achieved what he had been seeking all along: a life lived on his own terms, surrounded only by those who could meet him there, without demand or condition. And so, he became a different kind of presence in the world, one that did not chase, did not plead, did not bow. He walked in quiet alignment. And those who crossed his path could feel it. They might not understand it, but they could not deny it.